Anna adjusted her uniform collar as she entered the small grocery store, her eyes scanning the aisles like second nature. It was a quiet evening, the kind that gave her a small window of peace before the chaos of another shift on the force. Off duty, she still carried herself with the same alertness that had served her well throughout her career. As a black woman in law enforcement, Anna had never had the luxury of blending in, whether in or out of uniform. Her presence always seemed to elicit a reaction, be it a curious glance or, more often than not, an unwarranted judgment. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow over the neatly stacked rows of canned goods and cereal boxes. For Anna, grocery shopping was a moment of routine, a small ritual she could control, in a life defined by unpredictability. She moved deliberately through the aisles, picking up items with the precision of someone used to planning ahead. The familiar routine allowed her mind to wander, reflecting on how she had arrived at this point in her life. Being a black woman in the police force had never been easy. In a profession dominated by men, and often white men, Anna had faced years of skepticism, both from her peers and from the community she served. But she had risen through the ranks not by pushing harder but by pushing smarter. She learned to navigate the unwritten rules of a system that often felt rigged against her, finding allies in unlikely places, and forging her own path to becoming the first black female captain in her precinct. But it hadn't always been like this. In the beginning, fresh out of the academy, Anna had found herself constantly underestimated. Some saw her as a diversity hire, others as an outsider who didn't belong. The whispers in the locker room, the sideways glances during patrols, all of it was designed to wear her down. But Anna was resilient. Her determination was not born from a need to prove them wrong, but from a belief that she could make a difference from within the very system that seemed so stacked against people like her. Her journey to captaincy had been marked by quiet victories and even quieter defeats. She'd learned to carry the burden of being one of the few women of color in the department, knowing that her successes and failures would be scrutinized more harshly than anyone else's. But Anna had a resolve that ran deep, rooted in the lessons her mother had taught her growing up. "You have to be twice as good to get half as much," her mother would say, and Anna had internalized that wisdom, wearing it like armor. As she reached for a carton of milk, Anna's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was Emma, her wife, sending a quick text reminding her to grab a few extra things for dinner. Anna smiled to herself. Emma had been her rock through it all, a source of unwavering support in the face of overwhelming pressure. The two of them had built a life together that, despite the challenges, was filled with love and laughter, a refuge from the storm of Anna's work life. Anna was used to fighting on two fronts, one for justice in her professional life and the other for peace in her personal one. Every day she fought to make her precinct more just, to root out bias where she found it, and to push for reforms that would make the system better for everyone. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of it all threatened to crush her. But she carried on, because she knew the stakes were too high to do otherwise. With her grocery basket full, Anna made her way to the checkout, nodding to the cashier, who gave her a polite but distant smile. Even here in this small corner of the city, she was never just another customer. She was always the black woman in uniform, the captain who carried the hope of reform and the burden of expectation. But as Anna stepped out of the store and into the fading light of the evening, she felt that familiar fire within her, the one that had gotten her this far and the one that would keep her moving forward no matter what came next. Myron's radio crackled as a voice came through. "All units, we've got a suspect in the area. Armed robbery at the corner of 5th and Jefferson. Suspect is described as a black female, mid-30s, wearing dark clothing, possibly carrying a weapon. Approach with caution." It had been a long shift already, and Myron's mind was tired from the endless churn of calls and reports. But this one caught his attention. He had been patrolling nearby, just a few blocks from the scene, and his instincts kicked in. He flicked on his lights and started scanning the sidewalks, searching for any sign of the suspect. The description was vague, but in his mind, it was enough to go on. As Myron turned the corner, he spotted a woman leaving a grocery store, her head down, walking quickly with bags in hand. She fit the general profile, black, mid-30s, dark clothing. His adrenaline surged. This had to be her. Without a second thought, he pulled over, his mind racing through the scenario he'd imagined countless times. The training, the drills, everything that had been drilled into him during his time at the academy. This was it, this was his moment to act. He stepped out of the car, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt, near the cuffs. "Ma'am, stop where you are," he called out, his voice firmer than it needed to be. The woman looked up, startled. It was Anna, off-duty, dressed in her casual clothes, and completely unaware that she was about to be thrust into the middle of a nightmare. For a split second, Anna's eyes met his, and she immediately knew what was happening. The look on Myron's face, the rigidity in his posture, she had seen it countless times before in her own officers. That lethal combination of uncertainty and blind conviction. "Officer, there's been a mistake," Anna started, holding her hands up but keeping her voice calm. "I'm Captain Anna Bennett with the precinct. I think you." "I said stop," Myron barked, cutting her off. His training told him not to take any chances, to control the situation before it spiraled out of his control. His heart was pounding now, louder than the sounds of the street around him. His mind flashed back to the robbery report, armed and dangerous. That was all he could think about. Anna stayed calm, knowing that any sudden movement could escalate things. "I'm not who you think I am. I work with you. Just check your..." Before she could finish, Myron closed the distance, pulling her hands behind her back and snapping the cuffs on her wrists. Anna stiffened, feeling the cold metal bite into her skin. Her grocery bags fell to the ground, spilling their contents onto the sidewalk, but no one seemed to notice. A small crowd began to gather at a distance, some already pulling out their phones, recording the scene as it unfolded. "My badge is in my jacket pocket," Anna tried again, her voice low but firm, hoping to break through to him. She knew what this looked like, and she knew where it was headed if he didn't stop. But Myron wasn't listening, or maybe he just couldn't hear her over the sound of his own racing thoughts. In his mind, he had already made up his mind. This was the suspect. This was the threat he had to neutralize. As Myron guided her toward his patrol car, Anna felt a wave of disbelief wash over her. She had worked her entire career to fight against moments like this, moments where bias and fear took precedence over judgment and facts. And now she was living it firsthand, a victim of the very system she had dedicated her life to reforming. It wasn't until Anna was in the backseat, handcuffed, and watching her reflection in the rearview mirror, that Myron's radio crackled again. "Be advised, suspect in armed robbery at 5th and Jefferson apprehended. Different location." Myron froze. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and for the first time the reality of what he had just done began to sink in. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, locking with Anna's reflection. The weight of his mistake settled heavily on his shoulders. He had arrested the wrong person, not just any person, but his captain, someone he should have known. But in that critical moment, his assumptions, his fears, had overridden everything else. Anna didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The look on her face said everything. This was the failure she had fought so hard to prevent. Anna's mind raced as the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around her wrists. The sting of the cuffs wasn't new to her. She had seen countless people placed in them over her career. But this time, it wasn't a suspect being arrested, it was her. The sheer absurdity of the situation left her momentarily stunned. The very hands that had signed off on arrest warrants, helped write policy, and guided officers through difficult decisions were now bound behind her back, treated as though she were a criminal. She glanced down at the sidewalk where her groceries had spilled from her hands during the arrest. A carton of milk lay leaking onto the pavement, its contents slowly pooling at her feet. Cans rolled into the gutter, and fresh vegetables tumbled out of a torn bag, ignored by the officer who had just cuffed her. The scene played out in surreal, slow motion. A moment that should have been mundane was now transforming into something darker, something that would alter her life and career. A crowd had gathered. Pedestrians who had been going about their day now stopped, their eyes fixed on the sight of a black woman being arrested in broad daylight. Several people already had their phones out, recording the scene, sensing that something wasn't right. The murmurs began to grow louder as the onlookers realized the woman in cuffs was no ordinary citizen. It was Captain Anna Bennett. Anna's heart pounded, a mix of rage and disbelief surging through her. She tried to speak, to reason with Myron, but her words were swallowed up by the chaos around her. "Officer, you've made a mistake," she tried again, her voice calm despite the turmoil brewing inside. "I am Captain Anna Bennett. I work with you. You need to check your information." But Myron wasn't listening. His face was tense, his body language rigid with the kind of nervousness that only comes when an officer believes they've caught a dangerous suspect. He had tunnel vision now, his mind locked onto the idea that she fit the description from the robbery call. His assumptions were overriding the facts, and there was no breaking through. Anna's frustration boiled over. "For God's sake, I'm your captain. Call dispatch. Check your system." Her voice, usually measured and authoritative, now carried an edge of anger that she couldn't hold back. This wasn't just an arrest, this was a gross injustice. A moment that laid bare everything wrong with how people of color were too often treated by law enforcement, even within their own ranks. The weight of the situation settled over her as Myron guided her to the patrol car, the clicks of phone cameras capturing every second of it. Anna's mind spun, thinking of the implications. This wouldn't just be a misunderstanding quickly resolved once Myron checked her ID. This was now a public incident, one that was already being uploaded and shared across social media. By the time they arrived at the precinct, it would be a full-blown scandal. A woman in the crowd called out, "You know that's your captain, right?" But Myron didn't respond. He was too deep in his protocol, too focused on following through on the arrest to realize the gravity of his mistake. As Anna was placed into the back seat of the patrol car, she caught a glimpse of herself in the reflection of the rearview mirror. She had fought for years to change the system from within, to push for reforms that would make moments like this impossible. And yet here she was, another black woman in cuffs, her authority erased in an instant because of the color of her skin and the assumptions that followed it. The crowd outside the store continued to grow, their voices growing louder. People argued, some demanding her release, others shouting at the officers to check her credentials. Phones remained pointed in her direction, ensuring that this moment wouldn't disappear. As the car pulled away, Anna's eyes burned with anger, but her mind was already shifting gears. This was bigger than just her now. This was a catalyst. This mistake, this injustice would be the fuel she needed to push for the reform she had been fighting for. And if the world was going to watch, then she would make sure they saw the truth. It was time for change, and Anna wasn't going to let this moment slip away. The fallout from Anna's wrongful arrest was immediate and intense. Within hours, the video of her being handcuffed, with groceries strewn across the pavement, had gone viral. The footage, taken by a bystander, captured every humiliating moment, the confusion in Anna's eyes, her calm yet firm attempts to explain who she was, and the cold, mechanical way Officer Myron had ignored her. By the time Anna had returned to the station, the video had already been shared thousands of times, sparking a firestorm of anger across the city. The next morning, the streets outside the police precinct were filled with protesters. What had started as a small group of community members holding signs quickly grew into a full-fledged demonstration. Signs with slogans like "Justice for Anna" and "End Police Bias" filled the air. Chants echoed through the streets as people demanded accountability, not just for the arrest but for the systemic racism they believed it represented. This was more than just one mistake by one officer. It was a symbol of the larger issues that had plagued the department for years. Issues Anna herself had been fighting to change. Anna watched from her office window, her heart heavy. She had spent her career advocating for reform within the police force, trying to be the change she wanted to see. And now she was the face of the very injustice she had worked so hard to combat. It was a bitter irony, one that gnawed at her. She could see the anger in the crowd below, feel the weight of their expectations. They were looking to her, not just as a victim, but as a leader, someone who could guide them toward the change they so desperately sought. Inside the station, the atmosphere was equally tense. Officers moved with nervous energy, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Many were quietly supportive of Anna, acknowledging that what had happened was wrong. But there was also fear of the repercussions, of what this scandal would mean for the department, and for their own futures. Myron had been placed on leave, pending an investigation, but the damage was done. His mistake had lit a fuse, and now the entire department was under scrutiny. Captain Maria Lopez, Anna's closest ally in the precinct, entered her office, her expression somber. It's getting worse out there, she said, nodding toward the window. The mayor's office is getting flooded with calls. People want action. Anna. Anna sighed, rubbing her temples. I know. And they deserve it. This isn't just about me anymore, Maria. This is about the system. We've been saying for years that things need to change, and now the whole world is watching. Maria nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. They're not going to let this go. The protests, the media attention, it's not going to die down anytime soon. We need a plan. Anna stood, her resolve hardening. We're not just going to manage this, Maria, we're going to use it. This is the moment we've been waiting for. The moment to push real reform. If we don't act now, all of this will have been for nothing. Outside, the protests continued to swell. Activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens all gathered with one common demand: change. Inside, the conversations were more delicate. The police union had already begun pushing back, framing Myron's actions as a simple mistake, a misunderstanding that had spiraled out of control. But for Anna and her supporters, this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was the product of deep-seated issues that needed to be addressed. As the day wore on, news stations picked up the story, broadcasting the footage of Anna's arrest on a loop. Commentators dissected every second of the video, and the discussion of racial bias in policing was thrust back into the national spotlight. People from across the country started weighing in, adding their voices to the growing outcry. The mayor, sensing the political danger, issued a carefully worded statement, expressing concern over the incident and pledging an independent investigation. But to the protesters, it wasn't enough. They didn't want words, they wanted action. They wanted a commitment to real, lasting reform, and they wanted Anna to lead the charge. Anna knew that this was her moment, but it was a heavy burden to bear. The injustice she had endured had sparked something much larger, and now the fight for justice wasn't just professional, it was personal. She had to balance the demands of the community, the resistance from within the department, and her own sense of duty. But if there was one thing Anna had learned over the years, it was that change never came easy. And this time she was ready to lead the fight, no matter the cost. Anna walked into the precinct, her face calm but her heart heavy with the weight of the meeting she was about to have. She had been summoned to the office of Police Chief Henry Robert, a man she respected but also knew was deeply entrenched in the old-school ways of policing. The viral video, the protests, the pressure from the public, all of it had forced a confrontation that she knew would be more about damage control than real reform. But this was her chance to push for change, and she wasn't going to waste it. She entered the office. Robert stood behind his desk, his expression serious but unreadable. He gestured for her to sit, and Anna did so, meeting his gaze directly. Captain Bennett, Robert began, his voice steady but carrying a hint of weariness. You've seen the protests outside. We have a serious situation on our hands. This has gone far beyond an internal matter. The media is running with it, and the public, well, they're demanding answers. Anna nodded, knowing full well where this conversation was heading. Chief, this isn't just about the media or the protests. What happened to me was a reflection of a much bigger issue in this department. We've been talking about reform for years, but this is proof that we're not moving fast enough. We need real change, and we need it now. Robert leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if the weight of the situation had already exhausted him. I understand your frustration, Anna, and I'm sorry for what happened. But we need to focus on managing the fallout first. The mayor's breathing down my neck, and the police union is already pushing back, saying this was an unfortunate mistake, nothing more. They're framing it as a procedural error, not a systemic one. Anna felt a surge of anger rising in her chest, but she kept her voice level. This was not just a procedural error, Chief. It's a result of deeply ingrained biases that we've failed to address. Myron didn't just make a mistake, he acted on assumptions that come from a culture that hasn't been challenged. That's the real issue here. Robert sighed, leaning forward, his hands clasped on the desk. Look, I'm with you on the need for reform. You know I've supported you on that since day one. But we have to be careful here. If we push too hard, too fast, we risk losing the support we need from the union, from the mayor's office. We need to be strategic about this. Anna's jaw tightened. She had heard this argument before, the plea for patience, the call for gradual change. But the time for patience had run out. Strategic, she repeated, her voice calm but firm. Chief, we've been trying to be strategic for years, and look where it's gotten us. I'm the captain of this precinct, and even I was arrested because of the biases we've allowed to go unchecked. If this can happen to me, what does that say about how we treat the people we're supposed to protect?" Robert frowned, clearly struggling to balance his desire for reform with the political reality. "I get it, Anna, I do. But the mayor's office is more concerned about public perception right now. They want to launch an investigation to show that we're taking this seriously. We need to control the narrative before this spirals any further." Anna shook her head, her frustration mounting. "An investigation isn't enough. We need immediate action training on implicit bias, independent oversight, a revision of our use of force policies. If we don't take real steps now, this department's credibility will be irreparably damaged. We have a chance to lead by example, to show that we're committed to meaningful change." Robert looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. He wasn't a bad man, Anna knew that. But he was caught in a system that prized stability over progress, that saw any disruption as a threat rather than an opportunity. He wanted to help, but he was also afraid of the cost. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I'll bring your proposals to the mayor, but Anna, understand this, the road ahead won't be easy. The union is going to fight us every step of the way, and there are people who don't want to see the kind of changes you're talking about." Anna stood, her resolve unwavering. "I know, Chief, but we don't have a choice. The people outside aren't just protesting for me. They're protesting for every person who's ever been wronged by this system. And we owe it to them to do more than just investigate. We owe them real justice." Robert watched her leave, a mix of respect and concern in his eyes. Anna knew the fight ahead would be tough, but she was ready. This was her moment, and she wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. Myron sat in his small, sparsely decorated apartment, the faint sound of sirens outside blending with the distant hum of traffic. His head rested in his hands, eyes shut tight, as if blocking out the world could undo the events of the past few days. But it was no use. The image of Anna in handcuffs, her face a mix of shock and anger, played over and over in his mind. Each time it hit him like a punch to the gut. He had messed up. Badly. When Myron had received the vague description of the suspect, something inside him had switched on that mix of adrenaline and focus that officers are trained to rely on during critical moments. But somewhere along the way, he had let his instincts turn into assumptions. He hadn't questioned himself. He hadn't listened to her. He had just acted. And now he was facing the consequences. The department had placed him on administrative leave while the investigation unfolded. But Myron knew what was coming. A mistake like this wasn't something the department could sweep under the rug. Not with the protests outside the precinct. Not with the video of the arrest circulating online. Everyone had seen it by now, and the backlash was growing louder by the day. At first, Myron had tried to justify his actions, telling himself that he had only been doing his job, that he had followed protocol. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. He had let his own biases cloud his judgment, had seen Anna, a black woman, in the wrong place at the wrong time as a suspect instead of his captain. The thought made him sick. He picked up his phone, staring at the screen for what felt like hours. He wanted to call Anna, to apologize, to somehow explain himself. But every time he imagined her answering, all he could picture was the anger in her eyes. How could he face her after what he'd done? She had worked her entire career to reform the department, to make it a place where officers were held accountable, where people weren't judged by the color of their skin. And now, he had become part of the very problem she had spent years trying to fix. His thoughts spiraled as he imagined the disciplinary hearing. Would they suspend him? Fire him? The uncertainty was crushing. But more than that, it was the guilt. Myron had never thought of himself as someone who would make a mistake like this. He prided himself on being fair, on treating people with respect, regardless of their background. Yet in that critical moment, he had fallen into the same trap so many others had before him. He stood up, pacing the small living room, trying to shake off the weight pressing down on his chest. The union had already reached out, offering their support, insisting that he had acted within the bounds of his duties. But Myron wasn't interested in their defense. He didn't want excuses or justifications. What he wanted was to make things right, but he didn't know how. Finally, he stopped pacing, staring out the window at the city below. It wasn't just about him anymore. His mistake had sparked something much bigger. something that wasn't going to go away quietly. The protests outside the precinct were proof of that. People were angry, and they had every right to be. Myron exhaled, the weight of his guilt settling deeper into his bones. He didn't know what would happen next, whether he would keep his badge or lose it, whether Anna would ever forgive him or not. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a single arrest. It was about a system that needed to change, a system that he had unknowingly upheld in the worst possible way. Sitting back down, he stared at his phone again. Maybe it was time to face the consequences, to own up to his failure. It was the least he could do. Anna stood behind the podium, her uniform crisp, her shoulders squared, and her heart pounding beneath the surface. The sea of reporters and cameras before her felt almost suffocating, but she knew this moment was crucial. The video of her wrongful arrest had ignited something larger than she had anticipated, and the protests outside the precinct continued to swell. People were demanding answers, and they were looking to her to provide them. The microphones in front of her crackled with feedback, adding to the tension in the air. Emma had given her a brief but encouraging nod from behind the stage, and Anna drew strength from it. She glanced out at the crowd and then began. "Good afternoon," Anna started, her voice strong but measured. "I stand before you today not just as a captain in this police department, but as someone who has experienced firsthand the very issues that we are here to eradicate. The events of the past week have brought to light a reality that many of us have been trying to change for years, a system that, at times, fails the very people it is meant to protect." There was a murmur among the reporters, but Anna continued, unshaken. "What happened to me should never have happened, but it did. And it's not just about one officer making a mistake. It's about a culture within law enforcement that allows these kinds of biases to persist. I am not here to vilify my colleagues. I know that the majority of officers in this department work hard every day to serve with integrity, but we cannot ignore the fact that our system is flawed, and we cannot ignore the pain it has caused to so many in our community." Anna paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "That's why today I'm calling for real, tangible reform. It's time for this department to face the biases that have been ingrained for too long. We need comprehensive training on implicit bias and racial profiling, not as a checkbox on a form, but as a core part of our responsibilities as officers." Cameras clicked, reporters scribbled notes, and Anna pressed on. "We need to review and revise our arrest protocols to ensure that officers are making decisions based on facts and not assumptions. And most importantly, we need independent oversight. Our community must have faith that we are accountable to them, and that means an independent body to review incidents like mine and others that have shaken public trust." She took a breath, her voice softening but remaining resolute. "I know these changes won't be easy. I know there will be resistance, both from within and outside the department. But I am committed to seeing this through. Because if this department truly wants to serve and protect, it must first be willing to protect the dignity and rights of every person it encounters, regardless of the color of their skin." Anna saw the flickers of doubt and skepticism in some of the faces before her, but she also saw hope. People wanted change, and they wanted someone to lead it. She had no illusions that her speech alone would solve everything. The fight ahead would be long, and the obstacles immense, but she had no intention of backing down. "I'm asking for your support," Anna said, locking eyes with the cameras. "Not just as citizens but as partners in this effort. Together we can build a department that truly upholds the values of justice and equality." The room erupted into questions as reporters raised their hands, eager for more details, but Anna stepped back from the podium, signaling that her message had been delivered. She had said what she needed to say, and now it was time to let her actions, and the actions of the department, speak louder than words. Emma was there to meet her as she exited the stage, a quiet reassurance in her eyes. Anna knew this was only the beginning of the battle for reform, but today she had taken the first step, and she was ready for whatever would. Anna sat at her desk late into the evening, her office dimly lit by the soft glow of her computer screen. Papers were scattered across the surface, notes from meetings, drafts of proposals, and statistics that painted a clear but troubling picture of the systemic issues within her department. She was exhausted, but there was no time to rest. The momentum from her public address had ignited a conversation, but that was only the beginning. Now came the hard part, turning that energy into real, lasting reform. She had spent weeks developing a comprehensive reform proposal that tackled the roots of the problems she had faced, and witnessed firsthand. It called for mandatory training on implicit bias, a thorough review and overhaul of arrest protocols, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee that would ensure transparency and accountability within the department. The proposal also demanded changes to the way officers interacted with the public, with a stronger emphasis on de-escalation and community engagement. But Anna knew she was walking into a battlefield. The police union had already made its position clear. They were fiercely opposed to any reforms that they believed would put additional pressure on officers or interfere with their ability to do their jobs. Their argument, though predictable, was frustrating. They insisted that such changes would demonize officers and create unnecessary scrutiny. But Anna knew better. The real issue was fear of change, fear of losing control, and fear of facing the uncomfortable truths about bias and injustice in their ranks. In her meetings with union representatives, the tension had been palpable. "Captain Bennett, you're asking too much," the union leader had said during their last negotiation. "We're all for some changes, but this proposal, it goes too far. Our officers are already under enough pressure. You add these reforms, and we risk losing good men and women who feel like they're being micromanaged." Anna had responded calmly, though her patience was wearing thin. "This isn't about micromanagement," she had said. "This is about accountability and ensuring that our officers serve the community fairly and justly. We can't continue to operate as if the system isn't broken. If we don't act now, we'll lose the trust of the people we've sworn to protect. And that's a far greater risk than losing a few officers who aren't willing to adapt." The union had pushed back, demanding compromises that Anna wasn't willing to make. They wanted to water down the training requirements to eliminate independent oversight. But Anna refused to back down. This was her chance to make meaningful change, and she wasn't going to let it slip away, no matter how much opposition she faced. The mayor's office had also been cautious. While the mayor had publicly expressed support for reform behind closed doors, his concern was more about managing public perception than enacting real change. He was a politician, after all, and Anu knew he was weighing the political costs of backing her fully. But she also knew that with the community rallying behind her, she had leverage. The public wanted reform, and if the mayor didn't support her, he would risk alienating a significant portion of his voter base. Anna sighed, leaning back in her chair. The road ahead was long, and the obstacles were daunting. But she had come too far to stop now. Her determination was fueled by the faces of those who had been wronged by the system, people like herself, who had been mistreated because of the color of their skin, because of assumptions made by those in power. As she gathered her papers, preparing for another round of negotiations, Emma walked into the room, her presence a comforting reminder of the support she had at home. "Still working?" Emma asked softly, placing a cup of tea on Anna's desk. Anna smiled, grateful for the small act of kindness. "Always," she said, her voice tired but resolute. "But it's worth it. I have to keep pushing." Emma sat down beside her, taking Anna's hand in her own. "You'll get there," she said, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "And when you do, it'll be because you didn't back down." Anna squeezed Emma's hand, her resolve strengthening. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for the future of the department, for the community, and for all those who had been overlooked and mistreated by a system that had failed them. No matter how long it took, Anna was determined to see these reforms through. This was more than just a proposal. It was a fight for justice. And Anna wasn't going to stop until it was won. The weight of the day pressed heavily on Anna as she walked through the front door of her home. The world outside seemed so distant, yet its noise echoed in her mind: the protests, the meetings, the endless pushback from those resisting the changes she knew had to happen. But here, in the sanctuary of her home, things were quieter. There was no need to wear the armor she wore every day at the precinct, no need to put up walls to protect herself from the constant scrutiny. Emma was waiting for her, as she always was. The smell of something warm and comforting filled the air, and the gentle sound of jazz played from a speaker in the living room. Anna had no idea how Emma always knew exactly what she needed, but she was grateful. Emma was her rock. The one person who grounded her when the rest of the world felt like it was spinning out of control. "How was today?" Emma asked, her voice soft as she approached Anna, wrapping her arms around her waist. The embrace was familiar, a reminder of the love and stability that Anna could always count on. Anna leaned into the hug, closing her eyes and allowing herself a moment of peace. Tiring, she murmured. The union's still fighting me on the reforms, and the mayor's office is trying to keep everything politically safe. It feels like an uphill battle every single day. Emma pulled back slightly, just enough to look into Anna's eyes. You've always been a fighter, she said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. And you knew this wouldn't be easy. But you're making progress, Anna. Even if it doesn't feel like it right now, people are listening. You're changing things. Anna sighed, her shoulders still tense. Sometimes it feels like it's never enough. Like no matter what I do, there's always something in the way. The union, the politics, the fear of change. I just want to do what's right, but it's exhausting. Emma nodded, her gaze full of understanding. She had watched Anna push herself beyond her limits for years, and she knew the toll it was taking. That's why you have to take care of yourself, too, Emma said, gently guiding Anna toward the kitchen. You can't keep carrying all of this on your own. You're allowed to rest. You need to rest. Anna gave a small, tired smile. I don't know how to rest, she admitted. Well, Emma said, a teasing grin spreading across her face. Lucky for you, I've got that part covered. She pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and gestured for Anna to sit down. Dinner's almost ready. You're going to eat. We're going to talk about something other than work. And then we're going to watch that ridiculous movie you love. No more stress for tonight. Anna laughed softly, the tension in her shoulders finally starting to ease. Emma always had a way of making things seem manageable, even when they weren't. I don't deserve you, Anna said, sitting down and watching as Emma moved around the kitchen, dishing up dinner. Emma placed a plate in front of Anna and smiled warmly. You deserve more than you know, but I'm happy to remind you of that every day. As they ate, the conversation shifted away from the precinct, from the protests and politics, to lighter topics. Emma shared a funny story about a call at the fire station. And for a while, Anna allowed herself to forget the pressures of her day. She laughed, she relaxed, and she felt the weight of the world lift, even if just for a little while. Later that evening, as they curled up on the couch to watch the movie Emma had promised, Anna rested her head on Emma's shoulder, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Emma was her partner in every way, not just in love but in life. She reminded Anna to breathe, to take care of herself, to remember that she didn't have to carry every burden alone. You're going to change things, Emma said softly, her fingers gently brushing through Anna's hair. I know you will. But you don't have to do it all at once, one day at a time. Anna nodded, closing her eyes. One day at a time, she repeated, letting the warmth of Emma's presence soothe her. She knew the fight would still be there tomorrow. But for tonight, she allowed herself to rest in the comfort of knowing that she wasn't alone. The room was tense, filled with the low murmur of side conversations as Anna sat across from the police union representatives. The air seemed heavy with resistance, and every face at the long table wore a mask of skepticism, if not outright opposition. This wasn't Anna's first time in a negotiation with the union, but today, the stakes felt higher than ever. The protests outside, the public pressure, and the viral video of her arrest had created a storm that couldn't be ignored. Change was coming, but it wasn't going to come without a fight. The union leader, Jack Warren, leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of him as he spoke. Captain Bennett, we've heard your demands, and while we understand the need for some updates, this proposal of yours is overreaching. We're talking about our officers' ability to do their jobs without being second-guessed at every turn. The kind of oversight you're asking for, independent reviews, stricter protocols, it's going to tie our hands. We can't support that. Anna remained calm, though her frustration simmered beneath the surface. She had expected this resistance. For years, the union had blocked meaningful reform under the guise of protecting officers. But Anna wasn't willing to let them continue to hide behind that excuse. Jack, she began, her voice measured but firm, this isn't about making the job harder for officers. It's about making the system fairer for everyone. We can't afford to keep ignoring the issues that brought us here. People have lost trust in us, and if we don't address the root causes of that distrust, we're going to lose more than just public confidence. Warren shook his head. And I agree that some things need to change, but what you're asking for, implicit bias training, a complete overhaul of arrest protocols, it's too much, too fast. We have to consider the impact on morale. Officers are already under tremendous pressure. Anna leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. Officers are under pressure, yes, but so are the communities we serve. I've been on both sides of this. Jack is an officer and is someone wrongfully arrested by her own department. The system is broken, and if we don't fix it, we're failing everyone, including the officers you represent. The room went quiet for a moment, the weight of Anna's words settling over the group. She knew she was asking for a lot, but she also knew that these reforms were non-negotiable if they wanted to move forward. One of the other union members, a younger officer named Harris, finally spoke up. Look, we're not saying no to everything. We're willing to agree to some bias training and updating a few protocols, but the Independent Oversight Committee, that's where we're drawing the line. We don't want outsiders coming in and questioning every decision we make. Anna sighed, understanding their fears but refusing to back down. The Oversight Committee isn't about questioning every decision. It's about accountability. It's about making sure that when mistakes are made, and they will be made, there's transparency. This isn't just for the public's benefit. It's for the officers, too. It's about creating a system where trust can be rebuilt. The discussion dragged on for hours, with both sides making concessions but standing firm on key points. The union wasn't going to agree to everything, but Anna knew she couldn't walk away without securing some meaningful progress. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Warren sighed and leaned back in his chair. All right, Captain. We'll agree to the bias training and the revised arrest protocols, but we need more time on the Oversight Committee. We'll revisit that once we see how the other changes are working out. Anna knew it wasn't a full victory, but it was something. It was a start. Fine, she said, standing up and extending her hand across the table. We'll revisit it. But let's be clear, this is just the beginning. I'm not stopping until we create a system that works for everyone. Warren shook her hand, his grip firm but resigned. I guess we'll see, Captain. As Anna left the negotiation room, she felt a mix of relief and determination. They had reached a temporary agreement, but she knew the real work was just beginning. The reforms were set in motion, but it would take time and persistence to see them through. Still, Anna felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to stop until the department became a place where justice, fairness, and accountability truly mattered. The first few weeks after the reforms were approved were a whirlwind of implementation. Anna's schedule was packed with training sessions, department meetings, and visits to precincts across the city. The bias training had begun in earnest, with officers from all ranks required to attend. The curriculum had been developed in collaboration with community leaders, psychologists, and law enforcement experts, focusing on how implicit bias affected decision-making in the field. It was one of the cornerstone reforms Anna had fought so hard to get past, and now it was happening, but not without resistance. As Anna walked into one of the precincts for another training session, she could feel the tension in the room. Some officers glanced at her with thinly veiled skepticism, while others looked openly frustrated. She knew what they were thinking, that she was making their jobs harder, that these changes were unnecessary. But she also knew that change never came without pushback. The real question was whether they would embrace these reforms once they saw their potential. During a QA session after one of the training modules, a senior officer stood up, his arms crossed. Captain Bennett, he said, his voice laced with frustration, we all know these biases exist, but we can't afford to second-guess ourselves out there. We don't have time for that in the heat of the moment. Anna nodded, her expression calm but firm. She had heard this argument before, and she was ready for it. I understand that split-second decisions are part of our job, she replied. But if we're not careful, those decisions are influenced by things we don't even realize, assumptions we make about people based on race, appearance, or behavior. This training isn't about slowing you down. It's about making you more aware so you make the right call, not the easy one. The room went silent, and Anna could see the officer's face soften, even if just a little. Slowly, other officers began to nod, and Anna knew she was getting through to them. It was a small victory, but an important one. Change wasn't going to happen overnight, but moments like this were steps in the right direction. As the reforms continued to be rolled out, Anna spent more time in the field, visiting stations, attending briefings, and ensuring that the new protocols were being followed. The revised arrest protocols, which placed a stronger emphasis on evidence before detainment and required more thorough de-escalation techniques were met with mixed reactions. But Anna stood firm. She knew this would take time, but every small sign of progress reassured her that they were moving in the right direction. At home, Emma remained Anna's constant source of support. After long days, Anna would sit with her, talking through the challenges she faced. Emma, always calm and steady, reminded her of why she started this fight in the first place. "You're changing things," Emma would say, her voice filled with quiet pride. "Even if it's hard, you're making a difference." One evening, as Anna sat in her office reflecting on the past few months, she felt a deep sense of both exhaustion and determination. The pushback from the union had been fierce, and there were days when the weight of the resistance seemed overwhelming. But Anna knew that change, real, meaningful change, never came easily. It required persistence, a willingness to push through the noise, and a commitment to justice that couldn't be shaken by opposition. As she looked out her window at the city skyline, Anna thought about the journey ahead. The reforms were only the beginning. There were still countless challenges to face, still those who would resist every step of the way. But she also knew she wasn't alone in this fight. She had Emma, she had allies within the department, and she had the support of the community. Most importantly, she had her own unshakable belief that justice was worth fighting for. Anna stood up, her mind already focused on the next steps. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready for it. Every setback, every difficult conversation, every small victory brought her one step closer to creating a police department that stood for fairness, accountability, and justice. And as long as she was in a position to make a difference, she would keep fighting. The battle was far from over, but Anna had no doubt they were on the right path.